Thank you. It's going to be really hard to follow up on that introduction. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here. I know that my good friend and colleague, Bertil Tungen, has been here before, and he really praised the group and said I should look forward to be here and discuss with you. So fantastic to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the project that I have together with Thomas Boser, Ulrik Nisi, and Bertil. So essentially everything I do, both at this Center for Fair and also writing papers, I do with Bertil. So that makes life easier. Can be highly recommended. It's called A Competitive World. You'll see why. And the backdrop for this project is this literature on competitiveness. So I know there is a mixed group. So not all of you are economists, but if economists are very, very familiar with the literature on competitiveness, it's become, it's a very large literature, essentially documenting, and that's been the main focus, a large gender gap in the willingness to compete. So men are typically more willing to compete than women. And it turns out that this willingness to compete, and it can be measured in different ways. Typically, in the original paper by Niederli and Westerlund, they measure it as a willing to enter into an actual competition, to choose being paid based on whether or not you succeed in a competition, or just getting paid per unit you produce. It's predictive for your educational choices, your choices in the labor market, and so forth. And it's also been shown that the way, and I love this paper by Flory, Leibrandt, and List, it shows that the competitive nature of an institution, the way to whether or not you're paid based on how well you do compared to your co-workers, for example, it affects who is applying for the job. So women shy away from more than men from those type of jobs. Okay, so that's part of the backdrop. It's also been shown that it's not only the gender differences that are important here, but there's systematic differences based on income. So high income people are more competitive, highly educated people are more competitive, and younger people are more competitive. So that's the backdrop, by the way. There are some important limitations, and obviously that's part of what we're going to address in this paper. So one is that a lot of these studies, or most of them, are done with so-called reared samples, right? So the Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, it was like 6 or 8% of the world. I guess it's shrinking every day. It's the feeling that yeah. So the question is, to what extent does this really hold up, and this gender difference? And a lot of the results from this literature, do they hold when we look at a broader sample, a global sample? There are certainly some studies that have looked at this, but there is no systematic test of whether or not you see the same results across the world. And then there is another important limitation, is that so we see this difference, right, between men and women, for example, and so the gender difference in competitiveness. Where does it come from? Why, and more generally, why do we see this difference in the willingness to compete? So that leads us to the research question. So 3 things that I hope to take you through today. So the first thing that we wanted to say is, do the main results. So it's maybe a bit of a boring exercise, but we want to say, the main results from this literature that's been gotten a lot of attention, do they hold at the global level? Can we replicate this on a large global representative sample? So that's the first main thing we're going to do. The second question is to look, so our idea is that probably our willingness to compete is shaped during childhood and early and adolescence and certain formative years, at least to some extent. So how are boys and girls socialized into this, right? So have only 2 boys, but I know that I'm pushing them to compete a lot. There is a lot of competition in our family. Of course, I don't have I'm not quite sure how I would handle a girl, but clearly the way you're motivating children to compete is going to shape their attitude to competition later in life. So we wanted to get a handle on that. How do people think about the socialization of children into competition? And I'll, of course, show you how we do this. Okay, and the final thing we want to do is, and to dig a bit deeper, right? So are there systematic characteristics of societies that make the people there more or less competitive? And that might explain the gender difference in competitiveness. So, so that's the three main research questions. Okay. How did we do this? So we had several projects where we collaborated with Gallup World Poll. So Gallup World Poll is, I think it's safe to say that the gold standard when it comes to doing comparative survey research. So they collect essentially data once a year in 150 countries. The data collection is probability based, so they don't have a panel. I mean, a lot of you have probably done studies, and you have done studies as well. You use established panels. There's a lot of good things to say about that, but of course, there you have the issue that there are certain people who kind of select into those panels, and they might also be very used to doing experiments and answering surveys. So here you have kind of a fresh sample each time. So when they do it face to face, they essentially just randomly walk and then knock on doors. And if they do it on the phone, they randomly select phone numbers and call people. So that's the setup. We do this so we selected 62 countries. Essentially, we select all the large countries and then a few smaller countries. We cover 85% of the world population. And in each country, we have at least 1,000 respondents. So it's fairly representative. So if you compare our sample to the population sample, they're very similar. And we can also add population weights if you want. It doesn't change anything. There are, of course, always some, all regions. I mean, there are always some exceptions here. There are places where there are civil unrest, so you can't go in there and stuff like that. But mainly we have a very representative sample. We spend a lot of time, as you can imagine, developing the module and test it out. So we do pilots in a lot of countries. It's translated, I think, to more than 100 languages. And again, test it out. We also do a lot of careful monitoring of the data collection. So it's, I think at least some of you might be skeptical to some of these large-scale data collections because they often are based on, I mean, we do this as well, so I'm not a bit kind of prolific samples or something where you have very large, cheap groups, but you're afraid that there are bots or people who just professionally answer anything. So this is not that. So it's a very high-quality sample. We had 2 modules in this part. One eliciting the willingness to compete, and one eliciting what I called kind of socialization. And I'll explain them in a bit detail. So what we don't do, just to say that straight away, we don't do what economists typically do, namely eliciting the willingness to compete through a real choice. So that has been the kind of gold standard for economists, to see you elicit people's willingness actually to enter into competition with someone else where their payment depend. So they can choose between kind of get a piece rate payment or getting paid based on the relative performance. We simply ask them to what extent they agree or not agree. So it's a 5-point Likert scale to the statement, you are generally willing to compete against others. I notice one important word, generally willing. So we were going back and forth on this. So the survey question has been used before and also been validated in the sense that they show that it's very correlated with real behavior in these incentivized experiments. If you ask people if they view themselves as competitive, that is not a word that is easily translatable to 100 languages. So we decided to use this expression of generally willing to. Having said that, and when we presented this to audiences the last couple of years, we got a lot of pushback on this for good reasons. So people were unsure, kind of, yeah, but what do people really have in mind when you ask them, are you willing to compete against others? And we said generally willing, but still, what do they have in mind? So we recently, and that's why I'm super happy to present this now, we recently did quite a big effort to close that or to address that issue. So we did not on the same sample, I have to say, and this was on a prolific sample, but it's still. So we did 3 things. So we wanted to look at how answers to this question is correlated with actual behavior in this type of experiment. That was the basis for this. So we look at how agreeing to the statement that you're generally willing, does that make you more or less likely to actually enter into a competition where there's monetary stakes? It's essentially a version of this Niederli-Westerlund setup, and yes, it's a very strong correlation. Check. We also ask the survey question that has been used before on competitiveness, and that's super strongly correlated. And then we ask them also about their willingness to compete in specific settings, like sports, education, and in the labor market. And they're super correlated. So it looks like the question is capturing what we were hoping to capture, a kind of general willingness to compete in different contexts. Then there is this other big part of this literature that might not be, but is and I'm not going to give a definitive or take a stand on this, but there is this question of, is there really anything like a genuine willingness to compete, or can everything essentially be reduced to risk willingness or or confidence? So what we do is essentially what the literature does. We ask about risk willingness and confidence in a very similar way. So we ask them, are you generally willing to take risk? And are you confident in yourself? So simple questions, and we look at to what extent we see similar things when you control for those factors, the response to that. And then, of course, the willingness to compete becomes residual. That's the way we define it. That's essentially what the literature does, and we don't really take it as a stand. Okay. So that's what we do with the willingness to compete. What do we do with the socialization? So essentially, this again, very basic question. But here we do this is a randomized kind of survey experiment. So we ask people, is it generally, and we don't only ask parents, we ask everyone in the sample, is it generally important for boys or girls to be willing to compete against others? And again, as I just said, so you're either asked about boys or girls. And the reason is obviously if you're afraid that there would be a very strong experimental demand effect. If you are asked both, you answer, is it important for boys? And then you ask about for women, never for girls, and then you see what's going on, and that's certainly going to affect your answers. So people are asked one of the 2 questions, and that means that what we really want to look at here is the share of people in each country who's answering what they answer for boys and girls. And again, we focus on the binarized variable, agree versus not agree. Okay. That's the setup. We'll go straight to the global data on the willingness to compete. And this is what gives the title of the paper. This is essentially the raw data for the responses from the 66,000 respondents. And what you see here is that a large majority, 56%, agree or say that they're generally willing to compete. So in that sense, we're living in a competitive world. And it's about 25% who disagree. And that's the nice thing about doing these global studies. You get these beautiful maps, very expensive maps. Or what is really striking here is that you see huge differences, right? And we're going to get into those later on. But you see that in some countries like Japan and so many European countries, the level of competition is the willingness to compete is quite low. In Japan, I think it's 0.3 or something, 30%. And then it goes up in certain Asian and African countries up to 80%. So there's huge variation in the willingness to compete, average willingness to compete in countries, self-reported. And then we could, okay, so now comes the first, the answer essentially to the first question. Can we replicate, given these data, and now not focusing on the country differences, just focusing on the global sample, can we replicate the main results? That's and you know the replication crisis and everything, right? So this is good news, I can promise you, because the results totally replicate. So if you look at the first column, it simply looks at the difference in the share of between male respondents and female respondents who say that they agree to the statement. And there is a large 12 percentage points difference in the share. So globally, men are more willing, say they're more willing to compete than women. So that check, essentially. And you also see that the results on the education level it's standardized and I think we normalize it at the national level. And the income quintile in your country, and the age. So you see essentially the results that you have already seen. Men, highly educated, high income, and young people are more competitive. Easy as that. But it's nice to see that some things replicate, right? And then you also see, maybe not surprising at all, but still super strong correlation, of course, between the willingness to take risk and your willingness and your competitiveness and your confidence in yourself and your abilities and confidence and competitiveness. But importantly, controlling for risk and confidence, you still see a large gender difference in the willingness to compete. So that's essentially very similar to what you have seen from the red countries. Okay, so then you can break this down. So we look at we have looked at the pooled data. How does this look if you look at each country separately? And what is quite striking is that in every country, with one exception, and I wouldn't make too much point out of it, but that's China. You see a gender difference in the direction, right? So, and interestingly, the United States is among that where the literature has focused, is one of the countries with the largest gender difference. So this is simply looking at, for each country, the difference in the share of males and females who say they are generally willing to compete. So it looks like a very kind of universal, near universal feature. And the same thing holds if you look at the link between kind of high education, the link to education, income, and age, and risk preferences. You can make exactly the same type of figure for all those. So it's not only that it holds in the pooled sample, but it holds for all countries, almost all countries. I think this is the only exception, that China, for this exact link. But and it also holds, by the way, just for those who are into that part of it, the gender difference conditional on your confidence and risk preferences. Also, you see it, the gender difference in almost all countries. So it seems to be a very robust, near universal association. Okay, so that was the first task we gave ourselves to look at to what extent this how holds in across the world. The other thing we wanted to look at, as I said, was to look at how people think about essentially socializing kids into becoming. That's what we're trying to get out of that question. I mean, there are many ways you could have asked that question. We asked, is it important for boys or important for girls to compete against others? We could have asked it more, is it important to teach them? So there are other ways we could have looked at that. What we see here, it's a very competitive world also for kids. Actually, for the kids, it's even a higher share that thinks it's important. So I think something like 64% or something agree with the statement that it's important for. Here we just pool, by the way, pool also both genders. So this is the average of what they say for boys and girls. Again, huge differences across the world in how you think about the socialization into competition. With some countries, more than 80% say agree, and in other countries it's closer to 30%. So it's a huge differences in how we think about, should we push kids to become competitive or not? Okay, so what do we see here? So first, okay, so we had of course a pre-plan. We expected to see similar patterns when it comes to boys versus kind of the treatment difference. Okay, so that's a very different. So we have the difference, just to stress that we have the difference in the average response to the question among men and women, male and female respondents, and then we have the treatment difference in the question about socialization. And we expected them to be similar in some sense, right? So in a country where you have a huge difference in gender gap in the willingness to compete, we would expect maybe something similar for the kids, right? You're pushing your boys, not your girls, and then you see a bigger difference among the adults as well. So that's, but when you look at it, just again at the pooled sample, you don't see a huge, you actually essentially don't see a difference on average in how people how important they think it is for boys or girls to compete. You do see that men think it's more important than women that children should compete. You see that high educated, high income people also think it's more important for kids to compete. So actually the age thing flips, but it's a very, very marginal effect. And then, of course, not surprisingly, people who themselves think it's important to compete or consider themselves as willing to compete, they think it's more important for their kids, or for kids to compete. So that's in the poll thing. When you split it by gender, you see some, but I won't push this too much. So men think it's a little bit more important for boys to compete than girls, and it's the reverse for women. But we have a crazy large sample, right? So everything we look at almost gets stars. But I mean, notice that the difference is not huge. It's like 2.5 percentage points for men and 3.5 or for women in the other direction. So we see this effect, but I mean, it's not really a big thing. Okay, and then this is what's behind. You see there's essentially no difference on average, but that hides a lot of heterogeneity across countries. And we'll try to make sense of this later on. But in some countries, like Norway and France, Canada, people think it's more important for girls to be competitive or to compete than for boys. But in other countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, it's the opposite. Yeah. What can we say about where these differences are coming from? I'm sorry, no, and this is essentially, hopefully, answering some of this question. I mean, can we make sense of these differences? That's essentially what we're trying to do now. And our hypothesis was that it has to be linked to inequality of society. So the important, I mean, going back to a country like Norway, you can have a perfectly fine life without competing very much. I mean, we have a social security net, a safety net. We have, there is very little inequality. So, I mean, succeeding and winning in the competition doesn't give you that much. But in some other societies, right, it's if you don't compete and you have no chance of really getting out of poverty, and the only way to do that is to compete. I mean, I'm broad strokes here now, but that's the basic idea. We were actually inspired to a large extent by, when we thought about this before we looked at the data and then we wrote the pre-plan, by these studies by Dopka and Silibotti. Do you know those? Where you look at parental styles. So their idea is that whether or not you're permissive as a parent or authoritarian or authoritative as a parent, different styles, it really depends on the inequality in society. So there, for example, and this is, so if you take Norway and Sweden, especially kind of in the 80s, everyone got jobs and everyone earned the same, more or less. Why would you push your kid and ruin their childhood? You can just allow them to run around and have fun. There is no point in doing anything else, right? And we thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And similarly, if in the same type of society, why would you push your kid to be super competitive and to compete and win? If you could do very well without competing. So that was the basic idea, that it should be a link between social and economic inequality and incentives compete. So that would shape, of course, the adults' attitude to competition, but also the way we try to foster competition or competitiveness among children. So that was the basic idea. We look at this, we use two measures. So essentially the exercise now is just going to be linking willingness to compete to measures of inequality. The standard one, of course, is the Gini coefficient. We're also going to look at something called the egalitarian democracy index. This is richer. It includes the rights and freedoms of individuals are protected equally across all social groups. Resources are distributed equally across all social groups. So that's the more Gini measure. And groups and individuals enjoy equal access to power. Why do we do that? I mean, one is that we show that things are a little bit more robust, but mainly because that has a longer time series of data internationally. So we're going to use some analysis of exposure to inequality during childhood or formative years, 11 to 20. And then the time series of the Gini coefficient for, we lose a lot of some countries when we do that using the Gini coefficient. We're going to report that as well, but just so we have a fuller sample, we also use data from this egalitarian democracy index. But they're super correlated, by the way, if you look at them contemporaneously. Okay, so what you see here is just the association between the Gini coefficient and the willingness to compete. Average willingness among both men and women. I will get back to the gender difference now. So now we're focusing on the level of competition, willingness to compete in a country. And you see that in countries with low levels of inequality are less competitive than countries with higher levels of levels of inequality. And this also holds, but of course with a different sign, if you look at the egalitarian democracy index. But that's a very good question. And it's an important caveat to all this. So just to be, if you could have made more or less the same picture using GDP. And so you would see that then that the richer countries, the less competitive people are on average. And then the question, well, but that's super correlated with the Gini coefficient, so how do you handle that? And just going back to socialization, just doing the same exercise, you see very similar things, right? In line with the story as I told you, we see that in countries with low levels of inequality, people don't think it's that important to push their kids to be competitive, but in unequal societies, they think it's much more important. And then, yeah, and the same, you see exactly the same flip time when you do the egalitarian democracy. Okay. Sorry, now let's just slow down for a second, because now we're doing a very different thing. I probably should have had another slide between these two, just to prepare you. So this is to address your question. So what we're doing here is essentially to say, okay, so let's now, instead of just looking at inequality in society today, or the income level today, let's look at how the average level of inequality during your formative years. Of course, that's a discussion, what's the most formative years, and you can have different cutoffs. It's relatively robust to this, so it's... and then you see essentially exactly the same as we saw before, that if you grow up in a... if there's a high level of inequality in the period where in your formative years, you're more willing to compete as an adult. That's the basic story. And then, but here you see no effect of the GDP at during your formative years does not affect it. And controlling for GDP in the formative years does not change the estimate of the effect of inequality. So we take this as a kind of strengthening the story that this is to a large extent about inequality, and that it is shaped during the formative, your exposure to this during the formative years is what really matters. And we see exactly the same thing when you look at socialization, the willingness to, how important do you think it is for kids to compete? Even stronger effects. So if you grew up in a period with high levels of inequality, you're much more likely to think it's more important for your kids to compete. Summing up for this part, our take on this is that at least there is some evidence suggesting that important parts of these country differences can be in the willingness to compete, and in the attitudes to socialization can be explained by the inequality potentially combined with mobility in society. And in particular, how exposed you were the situation in your society during the formative years. So that's the story. Okay, so the final part of what I want to talk about is the origins of the gender gap. And here, our price, I mean, it's a slightly more maybe complex story, and it's harder to know exactly what to expect. But so yeah, the question is, what explains the gender gap in the willingness to compete among adults, and in the gender gap in socialization across countries? So here, and I think there are two very different intuitions, right? So one is that if women don't have opportunities, there is no point for them to be competitive. Right, so that's one obvious intuition. You would expect that if you have more gender equality, that's great for women because they can now compete with men, and you can foster competition among women as well, and that's a good thing. It doesn't make sense if they don't have any opportunities at all. Why would you try to encourage women to compete if that just makes them ineligible in the marriage market, and they become unhappy because they can't they would never be allowed. Right, so that's one mechanism. At the same time, you have this gender equality paradox, right? That has been well documented in some studies where you show that in more gender unequal societies, gender differences in preferences increases. Right? And there are kind of my take from that literature is that the intuition is that when you have more opportunities, people can also go in different directions, right? That can create bigger differences if there is a kind of inherent difference, for example, between men and women, and they get more room to develop. And this, of course, also may affect socialization in children. So the first thing we do, so we want to link then this again to an inequality measure, but this time the gender inequality in society. And then the natural thing is to look at the UN's Gender Inequality Index. I guess you might know this, but it's a composite measure reflecting inequality in achievements between men and women along three dimensions. It's health, income, and then I guess politics mainly, essentially. So that's widely used, but the problem with that is that it's we don't have historical data. So if we're going to use do the same type of exercise that we did with looking at exposure, we need another measure as well. Yeah. So to get the historical data, we're using then another index, again from this Quality of Government database on women's political empowerment. So where women's political empowerment is defined as a process of increasing capacity for women, leading to greater choice, agency, and participation in societal decision-making. I have to admit, I can't remember exactly how they construct the index, but it's based on a very long time series, and it goes back to 1940s for all the countries in our sample. And it's contemporaneously, it's very strongly correlated with the gender inequality index. Okay, so this is a null result, as you can see. And you see the same null result if you look at the political empowerment index. So essentially, on average, I have a more positive story soon, but on average, we don't see a link between gender inequality and the willingness to compete. The difference in the willingness to compete, sorry, the gender gap in the willingness to compete. So that could, of course, be that these two different, the mechanism we talked about wash out, but it's so that's the main story. But what we do, okay, so null result, adults' willingness to compete. But we do see a very strong association with socialization. So this shows that when you look at the way we handle the socialization process, there is a strong link. And in some sense, this is an easier thing maybe to interpret. Okay, so what's going on here? So this means that in countries like Norway, to take Norway as an extreme example, people are pushing girls more than boys. But if you go to countries, some, especially African countries and some Asian countries, they're pushing boys much more. So what's going on? I mean, if you look at why you might want to push boys more, I think the story might be super simple, right? In some sense, if girls are hurt essentially by being too competitive, if they don't really have a chance to compete, why would you push them to be competitive? They might just hurt them in the long run. Okay, so that can explain partly that, but what's happening? Why do you want to push girls more than boys? That's the hard thing to explain. So you can explain why you would want to push boys more than girls in these gender unequal countries, but why would you push girls more than boys in the gender equal ones? And my interpretation of this, but this is just an interpretation, is that but you still, even in the gender equal societies, you still have a large gender gap among the adults, right? So in Norway, we have a gender equal society, but still a huge gap in the competitiveness of men and women. And also a huge gap when it comes to people in top positions. We have a huge gap when it comes to recruitment into STEM fields and so forth, right? So, and we are aware of that, right? So you have this combination of gender equality at the same time as you still have a lot of gender gaps, and you have and then how do people respond to that? Well, some people think now it's in particular important to push girls because they have these opportunities, but they're not using them. So there seems to be something going on here, and this is at least one story that could explain it, but of course it's just an interpretation of the results. So we do a final thing, and then is to look at how this is, again, I should have said 11 to 20 years, it's the same period. We look at the average empowerment, as women's empowerment in that period. And what you see essentially is, and I think this is a beautiful, beautiful picture essentially. So what you see is that it's not that female empowerment makes women more competitive. On the contrary, it makes them less competitive. But it makes men even less competitive, right? So gender equality just creates a less competitive society. That's the basic story. And I think that's a kind of beautiful story. And I'm sure there are people who know more about these things than me do who could give even a better story. But it's at least for me it resonates quite well. That it has it affects the male attitude to competition a lot when these arenas are not only kind of arenas where men are competing against men, right? But where you have more arenas in the labor market and education where you're competing with both men and women, and that kind of pulls everyone down, but particularly the super competitive men. Again, it's an interpretation, but at least it fits quite well with the data. And we see this also exactly the same picture when you look at how you think about socialization of boys and girls, right? So if you were exposed to more gender equality during your formative years, you think it's less important for kids to be competitive, but this in particular for boys to be competitive. So that's That's the basic story. Okay, so then to summarize, I don't want to do a full summary, but what we have shown is that first, we replicate in the global sample the main results in the existing literature. We don't find any overall gender gap in the socialization, but we find large cross-country differences, both with respect to the gender gap and with respect to the socialization gender gap. And then we show that the willingness to compete and socialization into the willingness to compete is strongly related to economic and political inequality in society. And then finally, that we find this link to gender inequality in society, especially when you look at the formative years. Okay, thank you.